Please welcome Lenore Knudtsen.
All right. Thank you, Gail. It's great to be back in Wyoming, even if virtual. I think most of you who know me know that my son attends college at the University of Wyoming, so it's almost like being near him. I thank you for this opportunity. I feel lucky in that I received one of the most important topics in special education when I got this assignment to present to all of you on educational benefit. It is a hallmark principle in special education law, and most of the disputes, court cases, due process hearing requests, complaints, most of those complaints and due process hearings and court cases focus on educational benefit. So it's an incredibly important topic for all of us to go through. I encourage you to be a lifelong learner today. And to me, that means asking questions. If something is unclear, making sure that it's clear before we leave each other today. It's incredibly important to be able to take away what you need out of this presentation. I think most of you know that I have had a long partnership with WDE. It dates back well over a decade at this point, and I am appreciative of that partnership still today because it allows me the opportunity to interact with all of you. So thank you for that. Again, coming back to today's session, lean in, be an active learner, take something away from this. WDE has presented wonderful opportunities for professional development through the WAVES presentations. And this is an opportunity for you to get questions answered. So I would love to be part of helping you help improve outcomes for students with disabilities. Our topics today. First of all, we cannot talk about educational benefit without spending just a couple minutes on teamwork, because we don't plan IEPs alone. We don't evaluate students alone. We don't provide services alone. It requires teamwork. So we're going to spend just a little bit talking about teamwork, accountability, how it makes for better decisions and less blame, and in the end, better outcomes for students. We're going to talk in detail about aligning services to the student's needs. If an IEP is not based on a student's needs, you've missed an opportunity and you have a compliance problem. So aligning services to needs, period. End of story. If it doesn't happen, you are non-compliant. And we're going to talk in detail about providing services. Those services must be provided consistent with the IEP. You'll hear me say no freestyling. This is not a time where someone gets to make independent decisions, because remember, the first topic here is teamwork. Decisions are made in a team framework here. And then we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about educational benefit, FAPE, progress, behavioral needs, making it reasonable, making it meaningful, how you'll know if you have sufficient educational benefit, what to do if you don't document educational benefit. So we're going to tease that out in some detail. And then we're going to kind of end up with what to do if you have a stagnant progress line. What to do if you have a student who makes unexpected, unanticipated progress, because the school has an obligation in each one of those situations. As Gail mentioned, ask your questions. She's going to help me monitor the chat box and let me know when we have questions in it, because it's hard for me to talk and think at the same time, if you can believe that. So she's going to help me out here. Don't be shy. Right? Again, a few words about teamwork. First of all, the concept that the United States Department of Education made special education a team process is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Decisions are made by teams because they're better decisions when more than one person has input. Right? Teams also share responsibility so that no one person is to blame if you don't get the anticipated result. Teams incorporate parents as well. And the more you operate as a team, the less disagreement you will have. So this concept of teamwork is brilliant. Take advantage of it, celebrate it. And if you could identify one way to help improve outcomes for students with disabilities, it would be right here. Making sure that all of your decisions are made in a team framework, including the parents, so that you can have fewer disagreements, more buy-in, and really improve outcomes for students with disabilities. If you haven't included the parents in the decision-making process, you're going to end up with disputes, disagreement. When we talk about parent participation, I can't help but give a few COVID words in here. It has never been more important than now to communicate with parents. As schools are sort of rebuilding and recalibrating how special education is delivered for students, it's never been more important. And interestingly, next week I'm presenting at LRP, and my topic at the national conference is crisis recalibration, how to rebuild teams after coming out on the other side of COVID. And again, it's never been more important than now to communicate with parents. Parents, like all of us, did not realize that the pandemic was going to last and last and last. So in the beginning, there was some tolerance for services not being provided consistent with the IEP. That tolerance is long gone, and schools absolutely need to be communicating with parents and functioning as team members to keep their fingers on the pulse of current educational needs. If you don't understand current educational needs, you will not have meaningful educational benefit. So, parent participation, critical. We've experienced these unprecedented times, and sometimes that in itself calls for an unprecedented response. More communication, not less, because lack of communication builds mistrust. Right? Mistrust then breeds disagreement. So if you like spending your time responding to state complaints or litigating a due process hearing, or just in contentious meeting after meeting after meeting, then you can keep your communication as essentially status quo. But if you don't like doing that, now is the time to increase the parent participation, the communication, and the teamwork. So in summary here, do not exclude parents from the decision-making process. Do not make unilateral changes to students' IEPs. And interestingly enough, if you make unilateral changes to a student's IEP, and that is challenged either through a state complaint, due process hearing, you will be found to be in violation. Now, whether the operative question will be whether that violation rises to a substantive level to warrant individual student remedies. But there's no question in my mind that you wouldn't be in violation if you're making unilateral changes to IEP services. And as Gail mentioned in her introduction about me, I do this across the country. I actively work in about 20 different states. I can say, not just from a Wyoming perspective, but from a national perspective, unilateral changes to IEPs will be found to be non-compliant. And then finally, this is kind of a mixed COVID message. It's also a message that you can rely on at any time, and that is, don't rely on compensatory education to remediate your unilateral changes. It is a far, far better solution to use the team process to make changes as opposed to making unilateral changes. So why would we spend almost 90 minutes talking about educational benefit today? First and foremost, it's the law. And when we talk about educational benefit, it has this somewhat complex interplay between responsibilities and rights. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is that school districts have the legal responsibility to propose FAPE, which means an IEP that's reasonably calculated to provide educational benefit in light of a student's unique circumstance. That is a loaded sentence. School districts have this obligation, right? It's a responsibility. It's non-delegable, meaning that you can't just pass it off to someone else. Even if you place a student in another location, the district remains responsible for ensuring FAPE. So someone else may be providing it, but the school district of residence is still going to be responsible for ensuring it. There are very few exceptions to that. One exception may be if the student lives away from you. Another exception may be if the parent withdraws, revokes their consent for all special education services. Those are rare. So you have, as a school district, a responsibility to propose FAPE. And that means an IEP reasonably calculated to provide educational benefit in light of the student's unique circumstance. We know that language is an amalgamation of the Raleigh standard that's been around since the early 80s, and also the Andrew F. standard, both Supreme Court decisions that refined our understanding of what FAPE is all about. The point that I want to make here is that in light of the student's unique circumstance requires you as the school to have your fingers on the pulse of the student's current educational needs at all times. How can you possibly provide FAPE and the opportunity for educational benefit in light of a student's unique circumstance if you don't have a clear understanding of the unique circumstance? It is at times a moving target as well. Certainly coming out of maybe a COVID pause where school may have changed, the number of hours students spend in school may have changed, the way in which instruction is provided may have changed. All of those things will require you to get your fingers back on the pulse of the student's unique circumstance. So that's the responsibility piece. Now look at number 2. And there's this corresponding right. Students have the right to receive FAPE, which translates to educational benefit. And there's another right. Parents or adult students, if they are the IDEA parent, parents have a right to litigate a denial of FAPE. So you have this incredibly big responsibility with these corresponding rights that the students and parents have regarding FAPE. This is a hallmark principle. Yet still, there's no guarantee of success, because despite this reciprocal responsibility and right, no court has ever held that the IDEA confers some type of guarantee, right? So the lack of educational benefit means that an IEP team has more work to do. It is not an automatic denial of FAPE. So I don't want you to come away and think you are immediately doomed to failure and doomed to some kind of compensatory award or remedy if a student doesn't receive educational benefit. It will 100% depend on your response, because this right that I mentioned under point number 1 doesn't go away. If you experience a lack of educational benefit with a particular student, you have more work to do. You have to come back to the table. If you don't come back to the table, that's when there'll be a violation, right? So responsibility, right, and no guarantee. Just going to speak briefly about the standard, the FAPE standard. Again, this is the Andrew F. case, United States Supreme Court decision. Stephanie and I had the privilege of being present for the Supreme Court argument. It was the most meaningful professional experience I've ever had. Because those justices, there were 8 at the time, not 9. We were waiting for the appointment of now Justice Gorsuch. Those justices said over and over again, we are not educators. Tell us what is a reasonable expectation in special education. So it was fascinating to me to hear them say over and over again, the highest court in the land, we are not educators. Tell us what is reasonable. And this is what they came up with. This is the standard that came out in the decision. And they're talking about Andrew here, was a little boy with autism. His parents had parentally placed him in a private school for students with autism after he experienced a lack of educational benefit in the public school system. Right? The court is saying about Andrew, but his educational program must be appropriately ambitious in light of his circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom. So let's just pause there. What this court was saying and articulated in some detail, the Rowley standard that talked about, reasonable basic floor of opportunity, and the reasonableness standard still applied. And for kids who participate in the regular classroom, the regular core curriculum, we have all sorts of measures to help us understand and articulate and report back whether that student is making progress as anticipated. But for students who do not participate in the regular classroom or the regular curriculum, we end up with this void of what is appropriate, what is a reasonable expectation. And that's where the court, in a very heartfelt kind of way, said the goals may differ for these students who do not participate in the regular classroom, but every single child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives. That must be your framework, right? This is true whether the student is at the upper age limit for special education eligibility or the very opposite end of the spectrum and the lower age limit of just being entitled to receive FAPE at age 3. The same standard applies. What about stagnant performance? We're going to talk in more detail about what to do with stagnant performance. I just want to give you a glimpse of the standard here. And this court, which is the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, affirmed a hearing officer's conclusion that the school district denied FAPE to a student with autism and speech language impairment by repeating IEP goals, failing substantially to change his programming, and failing to reevaluate him before a new IEP. So what happened in this case is that the student's performance had stagnated, but they didn't go back as a team and rework that and get their fingers back on the pulse of what are the student's current educational needs. So if you look at just repeating many goals without being able to document that those goals are benefiting the student, you've got a problem. And look at the last few words, and failing to reevaluate him. We know that there's a 3-year reevaluation requirement, right? Everybody knows that in special education. But there's also a requirement to go back to reevaluation if lack of progress dictates that, right? You may need to get your fingers back on the pulse of the student's current educational needs, particularly when you experience stagnant performance. How long do you have to do that? Not very long. Courts will uniformly hold that if you wait months for that stagnant performance to turn around without doing something as a team to get a clear understanding of current educational needs, that will be a denial of FAPE. That's a substantive denial of FAPE that will result in a student level remedy. Okay. What about slow progress? Slow progress is a little less obvious, right? Slow progress is very much going to be tied to what is a reasonable expectation for that student. So many of you, or some of you at least, may know that I had, in my former life as a school psychologist, shared my home with 6 profoundly disabled young adults. They had all been raised in a state hospital and had come to my home for the first time living outside of the hospital. It was the most challenging work that I've ever done. And all 6 of those people were in full headgear. They had no language other than a couple signs and a few expletives. And there was none were toilet trained. It was just a very basic kind of day-to-day education that we provided. We were living together, so it benefited all of us to figure this out. And one of the things that I learned back then as a school psychologist that I brought with me now as an attorney, and I still live by it, is that there are incremental learners. I call them incremental learners. They learn in small bits and small pieces, but if you keep them on a trajectory of learning those small bits and pieces add up to change, behavioral change, language change, independence, all sorts of things. So do not give up on those incremental learners. Don't be satisfied with slow progress if the student is capable of more. If you truly have an incremental learner on your hand, you have got to have some great evaluative data to support your premise that your expectation is small increments of progress. Right? That should be a minority of students that you would even introduce that conversation, a significant minority. For most students, we should have them involved in and paced with the general curriculum. Are they totally on target? Maybe not. Is there a downward extension? Sometimes, but it shouldn't be a parallel universe. And you have to be particularly careful about the slow progress learners, because do you have a situation where you don't have a clear understanding of students' needs? Maybe you have not articulated the goals in a rigorous but reasonable kind of way. Maybe you haven't provided services to help support the students be successful with those goals. Any number of things. So when you experience slow progress, it means you have more work to do. I cannot miss the opportunity to talk to you about behavior in this moment, because we're much, much better at identifying progress when it comes to academics. We have all sorts of measures. We went to school for it. They gave us all sorts of teaching strategies and provider strategies to develop lessons and plans to help students make progress. Behavior, I think, is more difficult for IEP teams to wrap their skill set around and also articulate what is a reasonable expectation. Know that there are times in the federal regulations where an FBA is absolutely mandated, a functional behavioral assessment, an FBA. That comes in the discipline section. But know that courts will routinely hold that a functional behavioral assessment may very well be part of getting a clear understanding of the student's educational needs. And when we use the term educational, we do not mean just academic. We mean educational, academic, behavioral, functional, social, emotional. All of those types of learning are our responsibility as educators. So don't delay conducting a functional behavioral assessment. My answer would be the same no matter what the topic, whether it's social skills, academics, behavior, functional skills, it doesn't matter. If you don't have a clear understanding of the student's needs, you've got to go back to the evaluative table. And when it comes to behavior, one way to tease that out is through conducting a functional behavioral assessment to give you a clear picture of the student's educational needs so that you can meet your obligation to propose FAPE. In this case, the school did not conduct a functional behavioral assessment, and they did not have a handle on the student's behavior. They did not know what to do in order to be able to have behavioral change, positive behavioral changes. So the interventions that they were using were unsuccessful. The child continued to experience behavioral difficulties. There was a lack of educational progress because of these behavioral difficulties. So the court concluded that the absence of appropriate behavioral interventions amounted to a denial of FAPE. If you don't have a clear understanding of educational needs, you cannot get to appropriate programming. In this case, it's behavior, but that same logic applies in every case. So one of the things that I tell schools when we're talking about behavior is don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. Your responsibility is the same. Figure out the student's needs, get your fingers on the pulse of the current educational needs of the student, and then develop programs that will be meaningful and make change. I dropped this slide in here too, again, because of COVID, because we are essentially ramping up nationwide. I know I'm presenting to you from my great state of Arizona, And we just recently returned to school on a full-time basis. Before that, they had an A/B schedule where they had reduced by half the number of students that would be in school at a time in order to facilitate social distancing and things. So we are just coming off of education presented differently, different expectations in terms of school day. And so it always begs the question, did that change FAPE? And back at the beginning of the pandemic, I heard many states say, well, they can't possibly expect us to continue to provide FAPE. And the answer is yes, they did, right? If school was not in session for any students, then you didn't have a FAPE obligation. But if education was offered to other students, then FAPE was on the table for students with disabilities. And it's this quote right here from DeVos, who was the then Secretary of Education. The department, meaning the United States Department of Education, is not requesting a waiver authority for any of the core tenets of IDEA or Section 504, most notably FAPE and the LRE. So if you have not recalibrated your IEPs post-COVID return to school, resumption of normal operations, get your fingers on the pulse of the students' current educational needs, because that will be your starting point for providing FAPE. I cannot overstate how important this next point is. FAPE is aligned with the general curriculum. Now, for years, I have reviewed IEPs, sometimes in a compliance framework, sometimes as a hearing officer, sometimes as a consultant to a school district. I've reviewed thousands of IEPs over the course of my career as a school psychologist and a special education attorney, thousands of them. I continue to this day to see IEPs that exist in a parallel universe. We know that there is a very small percentage of students that cannot participate in the general curriculum. And for those students, you can align their programming and services to alternate standards. But by far and away, the majority of students in special education should have their services and their goals aligned to the general curriculum. So this is straight out of the regulations. This is the definition, part of the definition of special education. And in relevant part, it says specially designed instruction, right? Specially designed instruction. That says a lot right there. Adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child, the content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the child's unique needs and to ensure access of the child to the general curriculum. There's no mistake that FAPE is aligned to the general curriculum. So one of the things you want to do is a little reality testing about how are you thinking about goals for students? Are you aligning them to some parallel universe? Or are you digging in and unpacking standards so that you can align goals to help the child access the general curriculum and progress in it so that the child can meet the educational standards that apply to all children? Right? We have talked, not so much this year because there was a lot of forgiveness when it came to state and district-wide testing due to the pandemic. But in past years, and I know this happens in Wyoming when you have your data share out annually, and you talk about the disparity between students with disabilities test scores and the test scores of non-disabled students and proficiency rates. When we keep students accessing the general curriculum, we keep them in the general curriculum and the general classroom as much as possible. We provide them with an opportunity to perform well on those assessments, to learn the very same things that we said are important for other students to learn. That's our charge as educators of students with disabilities. So remember, if we're going to talk about educational benefit, you cannot break this link to the general curriculum. Now, I want to show you just a couple more points of alignment here between the expectation that you provide FAPE that is aligned with the general curriculum. Excuse me, just one second. Okay, here we go. This is from 300.320A. This is number 1. The IEP must include a statement of how the child's disability affects the child's involvement and progress in the general curriculum. Those are the present levels, right? Involvement and progress in the general curriculum. There's a definite link right there. Here's another point of alignment. Same section, number 4. The IEP must include a description of the special ed and related services to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general curriculum. So take a good hard look at your IEPs and test yourself, test your colleagues. Where is the linkage to the general curriculum? The clear implication that there's an education curriculum that is applicable to all children. And that's out of the Federal Register, which is the commentary to the federal regulations. So what is the starting point in our dialogue? Well, you may have seen this in different forms. I believe it's even on WDE's website in a little bit different form that you're going to recognize in just a minute. But I call this the FAPE continuum. This is incredibly important to determining educational benefit, reestablishing educational benefits, testing whether you have sufficient educational benefit. It is all about the FAPE continuum. What is the starting point? It's way over here at comprehensive evaluation. So you start there. This is true on your initial IEP and certainly true when you have a 3-year reevaluation. And it's also true any other time that you need evaluative data planned in a team framework to get at the student's now current educational needs. So you start back at comprehensive evaluation when you're planning to provide FAPE that results in educational benefit. You answer all evaluative questions, right? Your comprehensive evaluation is not complete until you've answered all evaluative questions. It's planned in the team framework. That means that it also involves parents. Once you have answered all evaluative questions, you can move on to present levels and needs. You must have a clear understanding of present levels and needs in order to get to educational benefit over on the end. Present levels translate to educational needs. So these present levels are going to describe the student across environments and across the general curriculum. You're going to distill that down into, okay, what does the student have? What areas are their educational needs? From there, you're going to move on to measurable goals. You'll hear me use the term over and over again, rigorous but reasonable. I see goals that are big and baggy. I see goals aligned to things like passing classes. I see goals aligned to things like graduation, earn credits for graduation. That is not a measurable goal, just so you know. That is not a measurable goal, and we're going to talk about it in more detail, is a rigorous but reasonable goal based on the student's present levels and educational needs. So each one of these areas links together. This line that's looping between them is unbroken. If it breaks, you have a problem, and you need to go back and find out where it broke. Measurable goals must be measurable. I know it seems somewhat duplicative, but I can't overstate that. They must be measurable. In order to measure something, you have to have a clear understanding of the student's baseline. Where are they starting? You have to have a clear understanding of an expectation, a rigorous but reasonable expectation for the student to obtain in a year, right? And then you set about developing and devising a method of measurement that will give you the opportunity to measure periodically and episodically throughout the life of that IEP. When we tie method of measurement to things that don't happen as frequently as your reporting cycle, you have a measurement gap. So spend some time thinking about, how am I going to measure the increase of this skill? Right? Once you have devised measurable goals, the team must now set out to developing services and supports to help the student meet those measurable goals. If not meeting them, certainly to make progress that's appropriate in light of their unique circumstance. Right? So those services and supports are critical. First of all, implement the IEP the way it's written. You continue to implement the IEP the way it's written until you change it. If it needs to be changed before the annual IEP cycle, there are methods to do that. You can change it by agreement with the parent and issue an artfully drafted IEP amendment with an artfully drafted prior written notice. Do not sit on stagnant performance for fear of changing the IEP. Get your team together. Doesn't have to be face-to-face all in the same room, but get your team together and implement until amended. Also important is document that implementation. Document the services that are provided. Document the successful strategies. Document the progress. Document, document, document. Those services and supports are delivered in the least restrictive environment. This is a mandate. Okay? It is that critical. And you will know by the end of our session today that there are 3 times that the federal regulations use the word maximum. And those 3 times are all pertaining to least restrictive environment. So we're going to talk about those as well. You do all of these things and your line is unbroken, then you get to educational benefit, right? If you do not document educational benefit, meaning that you're monitoring progress, you're monitoring the amount of skill that the student has obtained, the skill growth, the benefit to the child in the general curriculum. And if you are unable to document that educational benefit in the way that you anticipated the student would benefit, then you got to go back and find the broken link, because there will be one. So think about educational benefit in terms of what's reasonable. We're going to come back to that notion in a little bit, but I want you to be thinking about, what is a reasonable amount of educational benefit? How does this team articulate that in an IEP? This is the FAPE continuum placed another way. And this is the one I think that you've probably seen, or it's on WDE's website. Same concept. On this one, though, I want to point out that these are linked concepts. You should literally feel the link between each one of these. Evaluation links to present levels and needs, which then links to measurable goals, which then links to services and supports, which then links to the least restrictive environment, which links to educational benefit. Any break in those links is critical. If you have a broken link, you will experience diminished or no educational benefit. That's a problem. So when you have a broken link, you must go back and find it. I just want to pause here. Does anybody have any input, questions? Challenge me. I love to be challenged.
Lenore, I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
All right, thanks, Gail. We'll go forward. So, much like the FAPE continuum, your job in developing an IEP that will result in educational benefit starts with a comprehensive evaluation, right? That's that first piece of information that serves as the link to the next step. An evaluation under IDEA serves 2 purposes. Do not forget this. Identifying student special education eligibility and identifying special education and related services needs, the content of the IEP. right? Every single time you conduct a comprehensive evaluation under the IDEA, you are evaluating for both. If it's a reevaluation, you may have, you don't have to re-meet the same standard in the same way. What you have to do is evaluate to ensure that the student continues to be a student with a disability, and then the current educational needs. There may be times that you go back to reevaluation sooner, same purpose. You're always looking at, I need to have a clear understanding of the student's educational needs. If you don't have that, you won't get to educational benefit. You may have seen this wheel. I think it also might be on your website. I'm not positive about that, but I think it might be. I think of evaluation as circular, not linear. I've seen these checkboxy kinds of things that if you have this kind of concern, you administer X, Y, and Z for assessments. I do not ascribe to that method of thinking when it comes to planning and evaluation, because you're going to look at the whole child. You have to have the child's needs drive that process, not what typically goes with what on a form. So when you think about, envision this circle being the child, right? This is a probing question model. As special educators, we need to be the best question askers in the business. You need to be incredibly curious at all times and ask lots of questions. So you're going to generate questions and probe. Do we have concerns about the student's health, vision, or hearing? And I'm going to digress there just a minute because I have such a poignant example of this from my professional life. The 6 that I mentioned that I lived with, again, they all came to me from the state hospital. One young lady was diagnosed as, profoundly impaired, also profoundly deaf. She had no language, and she was a serious headbanger, and had just essentially caused so much physical damage due to her headbanging. After I lived with her for a period of time, when we talked about a favorite activity like eating out, going out, McDonald's, all of a sudden she would appear with her coat. This is in Minnesota, so not like Arizona where, you typically go out with a jacket of some kind. She would go get her coat because she heard us talking about McDonald's or going out to eat. And after a little bit, I tested my theory that she was hearing us. And then we were able to get her evaluated because we had questions. We probed and had questions. And as it turns out, she had complete hearing. She had been an expert in tuning people out over the years and appearing to be much more impaired than she actually was. So best example I can give you, probe. As a team, this doesn't happen by one person. And in systems where you turn this over to the school psychologist or the diagnostician or whoever it might be, you are missing the energy, the brilliance behind the team framework. You need to probe about this child to the team, including the parents. So do you have questions about her cognitive abilities? I'm back on my same student. Do you have questions about academic skills, communication skills, social emotional skills, functional skills, physical or motor skills, right? You generate these questions. And as a result of your probing, you're going to be able to plan an assessment. You conduct those assessments and answer all of your evaluative questions. Consider exclusions. And sometimes you have to go around again, right? There's 2 rows of arrows here because some things may lead to other questions. That's how you conduct a comprehensive evaluation. It's not through following a form or giving a standard battery. It's probing, what about this child, leads you to question certain areas. Again, this is the first step because the comprehensive evaluation under IDEA is for the purpose of determining whether there's an IDEA disability or a continuing IDEA disability and educational need. You don't ever get away from that. So the first link that we're going to make here is to present levels. That's the first link in the FAPE continuum. This is more than just test scores. If you are regurgitating test scores, or if you are saying, see the evaluation report, that is not sufficient in the eyes of courts. And I learned a lesson from a Wyoming school district. It had to be over 10 years ago. I don't remember where I was presenting, but it was somewhere in the southern part of the state. And it was a statewide conference. And we were meeting with different groups of district teams, right? Special education teams. And one district in Wyoming, I said Wisconsin, but I really meant Wyoming. One district said that they had challenged their system to make improvement in their present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. They had set out to develop a skill set to challenge one another. They had a peer review system in place. Their belief that they were testing was that if they had better present levels, they would have better outcomes for students. They would have better performance in the long run. They tested it and they said that this was the single biggest change in having their special education students perform better. And I took that message away. And I hope that I have imparted it on other school districts. If you want to make a change in outcomes for students with disabilities, right here, spend the time on robust present levels. Describe that student in detail. So number one here, we're talking about academic and functional achievement. Academic achievement and functional performance. What skills does the student currently have across environments, right? That's the second one. How does the student perform throughout the day? And you've got to link back to the general curriculum. The law tells you you have to. If you look at 320A, it will tell you when it identifies and defines present levels, it's about how the student is doing in the general curriculum. How does the student's disability affect his or her involvement in the general curriculum? All of that needs to be in present levels. Any reader of that IEP should be able to pick it up and have a picture of that student's functioning, academic and functional performance. Okay? So spend the time here. Don't just regurgitate test scores. Get multiple points of view. This is one of the places where having a team do this results in a much better outcome. I have been involved in many different systems where the different providers will, in discrete meetings or on their own, contribute to the present levels. That's only a starting point. That can't be the ending point, because they may have bits and pieces of it, whether it's speech language providers or occupational therapists or physical therapists or classroom teachers or special educators. All of those people come with an important piece, but it doesn't get powerful until you put them all together as a team. So when you think about the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, you are looking at compared to the general curriculum. We know that that's true because the law tells us that's true. So for some students, it may be very disparate. There could be a big gap between this student's present levels and the expectations in the general curriculum. For some students, it could be in some areas, but not others. They're on target in some areas, and they need specially designed instruction in other areas. This is your job to articulate in the present levels and compare that to the general curriculum. What you're doing is identifying skill gaps. If you don't identify skill gaps, you have no business drafting an IEP, right? Because that's how you link to measurable goals. Skill gaps are compared to standards, right? This is what we expect students of this grade or age to know and to perform, and what reading levels, proficiency levels we expect through our state and district-wide assessments. This is where this student is at. And we have to create and articulate an understanding about that skill gap, because that's where you go next. You're going to target that skill gap with measurable goals and then services to support the student gain skills that are missing. If you miss this step, you've got a big baggy IEP that is missing the opportunity to help the student close skill gaps. Okay. That's how you get to IEP goals. And those IEP goals are unique for every student. So if you are drafting goals with big baggy language like pass a class, earn enough credits for graduation, my best recommendation to you is stop. Stop doing that, because that is not a measurable goal under the IDEA. A measurable goal ties to a skill gap. So what skills does the student need to pass this gap? This class? And which of those are missing? And how do we help the student develop those skills so we're continually closing gaps? Think about a gap. Your IEP services and measurable goals help close that gap. You find another gap through your comprehensive evaluation and present levels, and you develop IEP goals and services to help close that gap. Anything less than that is not sufficient under IDEA, and frankly is an injustice to students with disabilities. So you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of present levels and skill gaps so that you can develop measurable goals. Okay? Again, these goals link to skill gaps. They must be measurable. They must be based on the unique needs of a student, and they must be designed to help the student be successful in the general curriculum. So there's those two words, rigorous, reasonable. Rigorous meaning challenging. That's the Andrew F. standard, right? Every student has the right to challenging objectives and goals. Okay. Reasonable meaning what can we reasonably expect the student to accomplish in a year? Their annual goals. And we know what's reasonable because we've measured, we've comprehensively evaluated the student. We've devised and articulated present levels of performance. We know precisely where those skill gaps are. So we know what's reasonable. That links to services and supports. Now you're going to design and provide services to help students meet IEP goals. Think about services in this way. And if you haven't noticed by now, I happen to be a very visual learner. So to me, these visuals help make sense of some complex legal concepts. First of all, the center of the circle is the general curriculum, right? That exists for all students, or by far a majority of students. There are very few students who would not be working in the general curriculum or some downward extension of that. Okay, special ed, again, is not a parallel universe. Special education comes in and supports the student in the general curriculum. Remember the definition of special education that I showed you a while ago in 300.39. It's specially designed instruction to help the student access and progress in the general curriculum. So special education services directly linked to supporting the student in the general curriculum. And then related services come in and wrap around and support special education, because by definition in 300.34, related services must be provided to help the student to benefit from their specially designed instruction, right? In our majority method of providing services, a lot of times that means pull out. So keep in mind, there's always going to be a tension between layering in more related services and pulling a student away from the general curriculum into some room or office to get that service. There's always tension there, and pay attention to that. Right? Related services are intended to help the student to benefit from their specially designed instruction. That's why if you have a student who does not need specially designed instruction, you cannot provide related services under the IDEA. You don't get to skip the blue circle of the blue ring to get to the red ring. right? And then there's a note here in italics, supplementary aids and services are also critically important, and they are provided to enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. Your team needs to be able to conceptualize these and explain them and articulate these concepts. Encourage a robust discussion about these concepts. Without this progression, you will not get to educational benefit in any kind of meaningful way. So once determined by the team, services must be provided in accordance with the IEP. Again, no freestyling. No one on that team, parent, principal, administrator, special educator, no one on that team has the authority to unilaterally change an IEP. There are very, very, very few ways that that can happen. One of them may be in discipline, but even that is very short-lived. So keep in mind, the IEP team determines services, and then services must be provided in accordance with the IEP. Now it's time to talk about the least restrictive environment. This is where we talk about the three maximums. Know that it's part of the FAPE continuum because it's a mandate. It is an absolute mandate. This is an absolute obligation on the part of the school district. And one of the reasons it's so critically important is because of those earlier links back to the general curriculum. When we have a general curriculum with, let me back up. Who is the expert in the general curriculum on your IEP team? It's the regular education teacher, right? They're the ones that are delivering the general curriculum in the general classroom environment. They are the experts at the standards for any given age or grade. So the thinking on least restrictive environment is that if we needlessly remove students from that general curriculum, we've taken them away from the experts and we have disconnected them from the instruction that takes place in the general curriculum. That disconnect is one of the reasons why students with disabilities do not perform as well as non-disabled students on state and district-wide assessments. It's one of the reasons that students with disabilities get out in the real world and they don't have the same skill set in all cases to be successful, because we've pulled them away from the general curriculum at times more than we needed to. So this is an incredibly important stopping point when it comes to the FAPE continuum. Remember earlier I told you there are 3 times when the regulations use the word maximum. All the other language in the regulations is about appropriate, based on a child's unique circumstance as the courts now interpret it. It's about all of these standards, middling standards, middle of the road. Here we've got the word maximum. And number 1 is in 300.114, to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities are educated with non-disabled children. So what that tells you is a couple of things. First of all, you should feel a strong magnetic-like pull back into the general classroom and the general curriculum. Non-disabled peers. So this is not about just exposing the student to the general curriculum in a separate setting. This is about educating students with non-disabled children. That is the starting point. Now keep in mind that the least restrictive environment is not a place or location. It is a bundle of services delivered in the least restrictive environment. And I put my arms out here to represent the bundle that's unique for each student. So one student's LRE may be very different than another student's LRE, which may be very different than another student's LRE. Don't get stuck in the notion that LRE is one place and it's only the general classroom. I would challenge your thinking on that and say it's the starting place, but it may not be the ending place. It may not be the least restrictive environment for all students. You should feel that magnetic-like pull back into the general classroom now to give the students the opportunity to be educated with non-disabled children to the maximum extent appropriate. Second time you're going to read maximum is in the 300.17 that talks about extracurricular activities and services. Again, we have that same language to the maximum extent appropriate, the needs of students to meet to the needs of that student, ensure that the student participates with non-disabled children in extracurricular activities. Okay? Think about that. Students have the opportunity and the right to participate throughout the school day. It's one of the reasons that, and I know I might offend a few people when I say this, but I'm an equal opportunity offender. If I offend one person, I typically end up offending everyone by the end of a presentation. It's one of the reasons that I take a really harsh view of eliminating things like lunch and recess, particularly for younger students with disabilities, based on behavior or performance that is related to their disability. First of all, we do not punish kids for having disabilities. Second of all, when kids are unsuccessful at certain things, we need to figure out where the skill gap is and then provide services, measurable goals and services to help build those skills so that they can be successful. When we take away things like lunch and recess, we are removing students from activities that the other students get to participate in. That's a problem. What we should be doing is, again, identifying the skill gap and figuring out how to help the student to grow, develop skills. We cannot punish students for disability-related behavior, and we don't want to separate them from their non-disabled peers without the next one here, providing supplementary aids and services to the maximum extent appropriate so that the student can be educated with non-disabled peers. So if a student is unsuccessful, say at recess or unstructured activities, the regulations, the logic and the brilliance behind the regulations is that you don't pull the child away from that without having first tried how to grow the skills that are necessary in order to be successful in a real life skill like socializing with your peers at an unstructured time. So can you provide supplementary aids and services to help that student be successful? In some case, the answer is no. And in that case, the student's LRE may not be with non-disabled peers throughout the day. You have to justify that though, because you have this magnetic pull back to non-disabled peers. You should feel that for every single student. It looks like this. And you can use these tools to facilitate the discussion at your IEP team table. Okay, so to the maximum extent appropriate, the student should be educated in the regular classroom. And only if the regular classes with supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved successfully do you move on to special classes or separate services. And only if no lesser restrictive option would work do you get to separate schools. And only if no lesser restrictive option would work would you get to residential settings. Make no mistake, homebound or home is the most restrictive option. Hospital and homebound are way over there on the right because there are no peers. There are typically no peers in a home environment and no or very few peers in a hospital setting. So only if education with no peers is the only option do you get to the home or hospital. I've been involved in many situations where the parent, in order to avoid a more serious consequence like suspension or expulsion, will say just place them at home. That is a team decision. And the only way you get to home is if education with no peers is the only option. Okay? It's absolutely critical that, and this, I want to make the point that this is not a try and fail model. You don't have to try the general classroom for a student who needs a residential setting. But what you have to do is articulate, get your fingers on the pulse of the student's educational needs. discuss what supplementary aids and services could be provided. And if it cannot be provided successfully based on everything you know about the student, because you've comprehensively evaluated the student and you have a clear understanding of their present levels and educational needs, then the team can say that won't work. And here's why. And so we're going to move to a more restrictive option. For this student, the least restrictive option is a residential setting. Or for this student, the least restrictive option is a separate school. Should be very, very rare when you get over to the right and say, for this student, the least restrictive option is a home or hospital. Should be very rare. Good example of this concept is a case out of Kenosha, Wisconsin. It was out of the Western District of Wisconsin, and it was a student who had lived her life in an institution for the first 7 years of her life. She was seriously mentally ill and extremely violent. Parents, bless their hearts, wanted to normalize their daughter and give her a fresh start. So at the age of 7, they moved to this Wisconsin school district. The parents did not share that this child had been living in a state hospital. They enrolled her in a public school setting. She's a member of a general classroom and not doing well. And it became very clear very quickly that this was a safety issue. And the school then began communicating with the parent about where this child was educated beforehand, trying to get some information from the parent about what is happening with this child. School made the decision to educate the child at home while they conducted a comprehensive evaluation. Court said, you could have survived that, school district. You could have survived that because you were getting your fingers on the pulse of the student's current educational needs, and you were maintaining safety at the same time. The problem is that the school didn't conduct the evaluation because staff didn't want to work with the student. They considered it a safety risk. So they didn't conduct the evaluation, and they didn't problem solve a more restrictive placement for her, like another placement, like a hospital setting where she had just come from. So they did nothing. And the school district was found in violation at every single level. Not because they had a challenging child and they didn't know what to do when they first got the child. It's because they didn't figure out what to do in order to provide this student with an opportunity for educational benefit. So you cannot do nothing. You cannot assume that any child is beyond the reach of public school education. If they need a more restricted placement, like some specialized private setting, it would be your job to provide that. Okay? We call that the zero reject principle. And it is established out of a case many years ago. And it was a case about Timothy, who only made eye contact with certain individuals and had no other academic or functional skills. And the school said, we have nothing to offer him. And the court said, essentially, shame on you. He is entitled to an education at his level, as would any other student be entitled to it. Zero reject. We get to reject no one. Didn't mean that this very violent little 7-year-old had to be educated in the regular classroom. The court did not support that notion. But the court said is you got to figure out how to educate her. You got to figure out how she's going to receive educational benefit. So then how will you know if it's working? First of all, you're going to monitor progress. You're going to do it frequently. You're going to do it regularly. You're going to do it in a way that gives all team members a clear understanding of whether this is working. The present levels are accurate. The educational needs are accurately defined. The measurable goals are rigorous, reasonable. The services are intended and supports are helping the student close skill gaps, all in the least restrictive environment. You're going to progress monitor and figure out if there's educational benefit. So collect data, share data at a high frequency. Do it often. Monitor progress toward IEP goals and progress in the general curriculum. It's both. It's not just one. Stay vigilant and communicate with parents throughout this process. Okay. When you run into a situation of maybe slow progress or stagnant progress, my recommendation to you is collect more data, share more, so that you can be responsive and not get stuck in a situation where too much time has gone on and you still have stagnant progress. What is a reasonable amount of progress? This was the teaser question that I asked earlier. I wanted you to be thinking about it. So been pretty quiet up to this point, but I would really like to hear from some people who are participating today. The team has already determined a reasonable progress amount, right? Where did they determine that? Anyone?
I'm not seeing any responses, Lenore.
Okay, extra quiet group today. Oh, Amber, go for it. Elizabeth got it. I'm gonna let Elizabeth take the credit for this. Amber, you can chime in too. Feel free, you've got your hand up. But the point here is that the team has identified what is a reasonable amount of progress in the measurable goals. Remember? Rigorous but reasonable. You said, what is a reasonable expectation for this student to achieve in the next year? That's a reasonable amount of progress. So you've already identified what's reasonable as a team. It's a trajectory, right? It is essentially a progress line. If the student is not making sufficient progress to meet those goals, that's a signal that you have more work to do as a team. So when you're talking about what is a reasonable amount of progress, you link directly back to the measurable goals. Rigorous, challenging, targeted, unique for each student. Reasonable, how much of the skill gap can we expect to close in 1 year? That's how you get to reasonable. You probe, right? You ask tons of questions. Now, what do we do about a lack of progress? If you have a lack of progress, meaning flat line or a downward trending line, this could be in all areas, it could be in one area, what do? The 4 R's. If you have a situation where no progress is occurring, either on one goal, some goals, or all the goals, you have got to engage in the 4 R's. I'm going to tell you what they are. You also have to document that you have engaged in the 4 R's. So that in the event of a challenge, because remember, the parent has the right to challenge this denial of faith, this lack of educational benefit, you must be able to demonstrate to a court, to a hearing officer, that you have engaged in the 4 R's. Who does this? The team, not one person, but the team. Get input from the parents, get input from the providers, get input from the people who are instructing the student on a day-to-day basis. When this is a reasonable amount of time standard, I will tell you, based on court cases, you do not have a long time to waste here. If you have a flat line or a downward trending line, you need to act. A reasonable amount of time in that case is very short. Very short. Think about that in terms of COVID. Students return to school, return to full-time learning, and they're not making progress. You have a very short amount of time to say what's happening. Why? Because if the IEP is not recalibrated, I can assure you that a court would hold that to be a denial of faith. Okay. What about unexpected progress? And what this means, and there is actually a provision in the regulations that talks about if the child makes more than expected progress, you have to go back. You have to, because you've indicated what's rigorous but reasonable for the child to achieve in a year. For whatever reason, this child makes unanticipated growth and starts closing that gap sooner and meets their goals. Okay, I have seen IEP after IEP after IEP say, congratulations, we're done, when that skill gap has not been closed. But they wait until the next annual IEP to recalibrate. That's a denial of faith. If the child makes more than anticipated progress, you have the same obligation, the 4 R's. Right? Who, again, the team, when, a reasonable amount of time. This may not be as urgent as no progress, but you cannot allow this missed opportunity to continue to close the skill gap go by for a long period of time. So you must recalibrate in order to be able to provide faith. If educational needs change, it is time to realign that IEP. How do you do that? You may have to go all the way back to the beginning. Do you have a clear understanding of the student's educational needs? So anytime you have a situation where a student has made stagnant progress, slow progress, no progress, or unanticipated progress, make sure that you pull out that faith continuum and say, where is the broken link? Do we have a clear understanding of current educational needs? Did we undershoot or overshoot on our rigorous but reasonable goals? Did we have the right services to support the student to close those skill gaps? Did we provide the opportunity for the student to maximize the amount of time in the general classroom with non-disabled peers so that they can learn the general curriculum, be successful in the general curriculum, and also learn from their peers? So again, anytime you experience those things, you must recalibrate. That means you go back and realign. Right? So how do you do this? And what are you going to document? You're going to document reconvening that team. When I say reconvening, to me, it really doesn't matter if it's all at the same table, other than your annual IP, that's a must. Or if it's at a virtual table, or if it's through a series of conversations, but you reconvene that team and get team input into it and work that faith continuum. So review where the student is currently at. Go back and probe. Do we have a clear understanding of students' educational needs? Do we need to go back into comprehensive reevaluation? Remember one of the court cases I showed you at the beginning? Student was stagnating, but they didn't reevaluate. That was a denial of faith, right? So tease it out, figure out what link is broken. Is it comprehensive evaluation? Is it articulating the present levels across environments or the current educational needs of the student? Is it overshooting or undershooting the rigorous but reasonable goals? Is it service provision? And sometimes service provision is the missing link. For instance, if you have a service provider that leaves unexpectedly, maybe they have a new job, maybe they have a new child and they're taking parental leave, maybe they've been in an accident or are ill, maybe they have COVID, who knows? The bottom line is, if you haven't provided the services, it is completely unreasonable to expect the same amount of progress. Do not rest on just offering comp ed services. You need to do this. You need to recalibrate by reconvening, reviewing, re-strategizing, and revising. So when you get to re-strategizing, you go back and say, okay, now that we have reevaluated the student or re-articulated the present levels, we now have a clear understanding of the student's current educational needs. We can re-strategize the IEP to make sure that we're targeting those skill gaps and providing services to help close those skill gaps. So that takes an IEP revision, right? Get this team together, virtually, telephonically, same table, elicit and gather information. Be curious, probe, probe, probe. Ask what additional information is needed to fully understand what's going on here. Develop a plan to gather that information and set a time to review the new information. This is what you're doing. You're working this over and over again. So if you don't have educational benefit or the amount of educational benefit that you anticipated, you must problem solve backwards through this. Where is the broken link? You've got to find it. So, review all information collected. Probe, probe, probe. That's how you start this puzzle backwards. Okay. The goal here is a clear understanding of the student's current functioning, because then you can go forward again. Once you get back to the broken link, you start forward again. So if the broken link is that you no longer have a clear understanding of the student's current functioning, whether it's due to an extended absence, lack of service, changing student needs, illness, whatever it might be, go back, get that clear understanding of the student's current educational functioning, and sometimes that requires a comprehensive evaluation. From there, ask, have the present levels changed? Articulate those new present levels. Were the goals rigorous but reasonable? If not, recalibrate them. Find out the broken link. Were services provided consistent with the IEP? All of those things will result in a broken link. Were the services not provided in the least restrictive environment? Did we create holes in the curriculum by continually pulling the student away from the general education environment? How can we expect students to perform well on expectations for state standards if we keep removing them from the educational environment? These are critical questions that you have to ask for each student. You cannot do this once and be done with it. And then you re-strategize. What services and supports does the student need to meet the goals? Because that's how you get to educational benefit. This team has identified what is an appropriate amount of benefit. You did it through your goals. If you missed that target, go back and engage in the 4 R's. You have to go back. So ask, what is the least restrictive environment in which the student can be successful? Understand the difference between placement and location. That is a tough concept. Placement is this bundle of services delivered in the LRE. The location might be Mrs. Smith's classroom versus Miss Knudtsen's classroom. Or it could be one elementary versus another elementary. Placement is the bundle of services. You may need to re-strategize the services, the placement, the LRE, all of that to get back on track to provide the student educational benefit. Now you're going to revise. Revise the IEP to meet the student's current education needs. Could be an annual IEP or an amendment, but my caution to you is do not wait for the annual IEP if you have a student who is stagnating, making no progress, or makes more than anticipated progress. Once you re-strategize and revise, you now go as a team and provide services and supports in conformity with the amended IEP. This is a time to keep more frequent progress data. You keep it more frequently, meaning you collect it more frequently and you report it more frequently. Because you just made a change based on either lack of progress or unanticipated progress. You didn't have a clear understanding of the student's needs. Now you've made this amendment, you got to test. Did we make the right amendment? Did we realign in a way that's going to result in educational benefit for the student? Did our recalibration work? If the student is not receiving that anticipated educational benefit, or if the student makes unanticipated progress, you go back to the 4 R's. For students with very challenging behaviors, for students who may be very high needs, for instance, on the autism spectrum, you may engage in the 4 R's regularly and continually because you need to recalibrate in order to get educational benefit. So I think we are at almost every minute of our time. We have like 2 minutes left. I don't know if Gail has some closing remarks she needs to make, but I would be happy to entertain any questions at this point. I'd also be happy to get your feedback. I love to be challenged if anybody thinks about this differently than I do.
Lenore, while we're waiting for questions, I just want to say thank you. We are at the end of the session. Don't forget to click on the evaluation link in the chat box so you'll be entered to win the rolling tote. We will keep the meeting open for a few more minutes so that people can follow the links, and please feel free to post those questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks, Gal. I'll hang for just a couple minutes yet too, in case anybody has questions.
You bet.
You're welcome, everyone. I'll take this time to tell you that I'm standing in a 115-year-old building that used to be a carriage house for horses. It's now my webinar room.
Nice.
So it's just me and the smell of horses in here.
Well, we must have had a shy group today, Lenore.
That's all right. If any questions come in, I'm happy to answer them via email too, if you want. So if not,
Okay.
maybe they got a clear understanding of what I was trying to present.
Maybe, and that would be my vote right there.
All right. Well, thank you. And
Oh, here's a note from Michael. Did you see this?
oh, there's Michael. Weather
Michael,
must be a factor. Pretty gloomy in many parts of the state. Well, Michael, it's about 74 and sunshine here, so I don't share your gloom. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thanks, Lenore.